Is it finally time to put the skills I learned apprenticing for a crazy fur designer while living in the back room of the atelier to use? I think yes. It's my baby brother's birthday soon, and since he mentioned wanting an ushanka or trapper's cap, I decided I didn't want to just find one for him, I wanted to make one. So if you're new here, my name is Maya, this is Marble, and let's get into another chaotic project video. Today we're sewing fur. So basically, I have this stash of furs on top of my boiler that I've been collecting over the past year from thrift stores in order to do my own fur upcycling project. The goal is to eventually do a coat, but I think this is a good start to get back into the swing of working with fur, especially fur that has already been worked with, used, and that needs a little bit of extra love and care. I have this small panel of gray rabbit fur, the perfect color for the references my brother sent me of hats he liked, so I was pretty pleased. First though, I needed to come up with a pattern. As always, your girl is in a time crunch, so I had to work fast. I pulled out my handy dandy foam head and added a beanie over it that made the overall measurements match my brother's. Then I got to sketching and patterning. After doing a little bit of research, I went for this overall look of the pattern since I had to keep the fur direction in mind and I wanted to account for that in the plan. I do always opt for patterning things myself, but I know that can be a challenge, so hopefully this diagram might be useful for someone trying to start out. Once I got my plans sorted and my math, I started tracing and cutting out the patterns. Since I have so little fur, I wanted to make sure that the pattern worked before I even thought about cutting the fur, and in order to do that, I went ahead and pinned the pieces together on my foam head and marked any excesses to trim before the final version. With that finished, I needed to address the padding. As always, I'm looking to my scrap basket for some good insulation and structural materials. So then, using my pattern, I traced and cut all the necessary pieces. I started with a quilted fabric that had a bit of batting between 2 layers of cotton, and after a quick test on the serger to make sure everything is working correctly, I got started with sealing all of the edges. Once I got all the pieces done, I felt they were still going to be a little thin, so I pulled out this heavier cotton knit and prepped the pieces the same way in order to essentially seal the quilting inside of the knit. And once again, it's time to double check that everything works before we touch the fur. So I'm safety pinning all the panels together to confirm that no adjustments are needed. Thankfully, everything came together. Speaking of fur, I think it's worth addressing the anti-fur comments that I'm gonna get so that I don't have to explain myself in the comments. First and foremost, what is fur? Fur is an animal's natural defense against the elements, and technically it's classified as a denser, shorter undercoat combined with long guard hairs, but colloquially people tend to include lambskins and pelts into the fashion concept of fur. Essentially, the combination of the animal's actual skin as the backing with the hairs that grow out of it. Furs, leathers, and animal skins have been used by humans since at least the Pleistocene period. Extremely warm, durable, and breathable materials that are also natural so that they can be broken down by the environment. Small animals, birds, and all manners of creatures use the remnants of fur to line their burrows and nests. Now you might say this is all nice and kumbaya, but back then, we were more like animals. And now we can make vegan furs and vegan leathers, so why should we continue to kill animals just for their skin? Well, let's start with addressing that last point, killing animals just for the skin. When it comes to rare exotic furs and leathers, I completely agree. Many come from animals too small to really be used for their meat, and wild or endangered animals that can be susceptible to illegal poaching. However, when it comes to leather in the fashion and textiles industry, 99% of that leather actually comes from agricultural livestock. Leather is largely a byproduct of the worldwide meat industry and is in fact a sustainable method to use as much of the animal as possible. It's actually not profitable for farmers to raise animals just for their skin, for their leather, and the majority of the profit comes from the meat. If there was no leather industry, that would simply be discarded, creating even more waste. Now, I can already hear the suggestion of, well, you should just be vegan then, and reject every part of this. And to that I say, fair enough. If someone's in a position to do so, by all means, that can be your choice. However, what are the implications? A, all vegan alternatives to leather and fur are plastic. Straight up plastic. There's some interesting research going on in fruit and vegetable leathers. However, so far, the only viable, durable options really are pretty much just coated in plastic, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of that. B, then we have vegan meat alternatives. If you want to go vegan, we all know the basic points of price and accessibility, so I'm not going to get into those. And there are certainly ways to get enough protein from non-meat sources that aren't specific vegan meat alternatives. But it's definitely not the easiest way. And on top of that, if we do look at those vegan meat alternatives, what's the problem there? Well, they're extremely processed foods, high levels of sodium, sugars, additives, and general lack of the nutritional value that meat can provide. And while I'm a believer that a varied diet is key and health can be achieved in many ways, a varied diet including some animal proteins is the gold standard and is historically precedented as a natural diet for omnivorous animals like humans. Because we are animals. Even with our plastic Tupperwares and fancy clothes, we are still animals, and there's nothing unnatural about animals eating other animals. Now, there's a strong point against all of this being natural that I do think is worth discussing. In nature, ecosystems tend to regulate top predators through the carrying capacity of their prey. However, we have gamed the system and cheated nature, and this has had some serious ramifications on the environment. The meat industry is responsible for between 10 and 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions and the majority of methane gas emissions. There's also damage to land arability due to excess manure and improper field rotation, as well as animal diseases caused by cramped quarters. I think all of these are strong points for reducing the place of animal protein in our diets, and subsequently the quantity of leather and pelts that will come from that. But one single cowhide can make 18 pairs of shoes. And if we stopped using the leather from animal hides, they would simply become another waste product. Another thing to dispose of, so an overall reduced and more mindful consumption of all products, both food, clothing, services, anything, would be great. And for me personally, this point is the strongest. The environmental impact is far important to me than the animals. Call me heartless if you want, it's just how I feel, and I really feel that if animals are raised with respect, live in decent conditions, or are hunted ethically, I see it as an acceptable practice. And I think a global shift towards more varied diets that get protein from more sources and rely on meat less would have an amazing impact on global health as well as the environment. Now, I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, so back to fur. Where does fur fit into this? Well, most animals used for fur are not livestock animals. They're either raised just for fur, like in the example of mink, or they're hunted wild animals. Before you get up in arms over that, as many environmental scientists or ecologists might tell you, there is a value to hunting. Before each hunting season, ecologists painstakingly document all the information they can find about a natural area to determine if the system is in balance. Due to human environmental impacts, global warming, and climate change, there are often imbalances within the populations of the animals. For example, in Canada, it's necessary to keep the deer population stable in order to protect the flora of a region from being overeaten and affecting other species. Or if wolf population spikes, it could severely affect the prey animal population, which then can't eat the flora, and then through the digestive process provide the necessary nutrients to soil creatures that then keep the soil healthy for the plant life. Or excessive rabbit or fox populations that then affect the population of birds, which reduces seed dispersal, whose excess waste can poison the soil with excess nitrogen that then runs off into bodies of water, leading to algae blooms, affecting fish populations. It's incredibly interesting to see how delicate the balance really is in nature, and we are an animal that's part of that circle, and we do hold a role in keeping that balance, as well as making up for much of the imbalancing that we do. I really could go on and on this subject, and maybe I should do a podcast episode discussing this more in depth, so make sure to let me know in the comments if you're interested in seeing something like that, or let me know if you think I'm wrong. Let me know if you have any sources or things that you want me to check out that might change my opinion. And the final point I bring, and my personal MO when it comes to using these materials, is recycled fur. I actually apprenticed with a fur designer who was a 5th generation furrier whose family used to do trapping and, the whole process from A to Z. But now, he was turning things around a little bit. He would source damaged fur coats from auctions, donations, thrift stores, and then carefully dismantle them, treat them, and patchwork them into new items. From hats and bags to coats, he did classic styles, but also had a personal aesthetic of using unique geometric patterns to create beautiful textures of different lengths and different colors of fur. I will try and put some pictures somewhere around here from when I worked there. I found this really inspiring, and it's really guided the choices that I've made in my personal work. And that is why I have that stash of pelts that I mentioned earlier. Every time I see them in the thrift store, the flea market, I buy them, keep them until I have an idea for them, and then turn them into something new. And for me, this is a magical experience to give something new life. And I really feel that it respects the animal and its life more by not letting its fur be discarded. Whenever I do use the fur, I keep every leftover tiny scrap for eventual patchworking, no matter how small it is. In summary, I think leathers and pelts from livestock should be used to respect the animal's life and maximally use the resource. Fur acquired through ethical hunting practices of non-at-risk or endangered species is an acceptable source as well. Recycled and vintage fur restoration, though, is in my mind the most ethical method to incorporating fur in fashion and is my personal way to go about it. And with that, let's get to cutting some fur. When working with fur, you can't just cut it with scissors. You'll end up hacking half the hair off and making all your seams have weird, jagged hairstyles. In order to avoid this, you need to use a very sharp blade, such as an X-Acto knife, but you can't just lay it on the table and cut it like a piece of cardboard. You have to hold the skin gently above the surface and saw your blade back and forth. This is also very important in order to not tear the skin. You can't just drag the blade across. You have to do this sawing back and forth motion that gently splits the skin. In order to ensure that my patterns would perfectly match my padding inserts, I opted to trace those on the fur rather than the original pattern pieces, since the fur will need a little bit of extra room to accommodate those inner layers. After sewing at these pieces for the better part of an hour, I was finally done. I was relieved at first, before it dawned on me that I no longer live in a fur atelier, and I have no access to a fur machine, and while I have hand-sewn furs before, I could tell the rabbit skin was a little too thin to accommodate a heavy nylon thread with a blanket stitch and did need to be machine sewn. It was time to put my creative brain to the test, so I brainstormed until I came up with the idea of using paper tape to stick the pieces together, wrong sides out, while carefully tucking in the hairs to keep them out of the way of the faux tape seam. Then, once all secured, I sewed directly through the tape and then trimmed it off afterwards. I thought cutting was going to be the hardest part, but boy was I wrong. This actually drove me slightly crazy, trying to make sure not a single hair was getting stuck, on top of having to wipe down the needle with rubbing alcohol, since the stickiness of the tape was building up after every couple seams. Suffice to say, I will be finding a better method in the future, or maybe buying a fur machine, but as far as a time crunch solution, this worked surprisingly well. Then, I assembled the main hat, bottom fold-over flap, and front flap in 3 separate pieces, before checking that all my padding layers fit well inside of them. Thankfully, my double measuring and double checking paid off, and all the pieces were fitting perfectly. So I quickly hand sewed all of the stuffing panels together and fitted them in place with the fur top and fold over pieces. I've been working on this hat since right after work, so around 5, and it's now 10 p.m. and I'm dying, so I think it's time for a little ice cream break. And basically the only thing I have left is to hand sew that bottom part on, and then to sew in, to do the lining and to sew that in, and to sew the front flap on. My camera died while I thought it was still filming, so I made these little loops and strings here so that he can tie it up at the top. And I also sewed everything mostly together except for this final piece that will have to be hand sewn. And yeah, time to get to it. Quick marble and ice cream break. We're watching Drag Race, and she's a big fan, as I'm sure you can tell. Alrighty, so now I have finished sewing up the outside. I still have to attach this front flap, but before I do that, I need to do the inner lining, which I'm going to do out of this fabric that I got for a different project I did a while ago, and I have so much left over. So for the inner lining, I'm basically just going to cut a circle of this fabric that's going to be big enough to fit inside the whole hat, face the edge, pull it tighter to create like a cinching, I don't know, but basically a little morsel to go on the inside. And then once I sew that in, I'll be able to finish the final inside edge of the fur, as well as put the front flap in. So let's get to it. I think I was struggling a bit to explain it there, but basically what I'm doing here is an easy cheat for lining the inside of a hat, especially if you're using a stretchy knit. All you have to do is cut a circle that is about 1.5 times bigger than the circumference of the inside of the hat. If you want to be safe, you can always do 2 times and trim later if needed. Then, once you have your circle, you sew a running stitch about 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric all the way around the circumference of the circle. Then, before tying off the thread, you pull the fabric together along the thread, scrunching it up. Personally, I prefer to work this as I go, but you can also do it at the end. Once it's all cinched, it should create a sort of pouch. Now, it's very important at this point not to get ahead of yourself and tie it off yet. Before you tie it off, you have to fit it into your hat and make sure that there's enough slackness that your newly cinched circumference matches the circumference of the inside of the hat without causing any unnecessary tension. Only then can you tie it off. I think I've said circumference about 1,000,000 times in the last minute, but I promise that should be the last one. Now it's time to turn the fur hat inside out and sew that lining in. I'm doing a simple felling stitch after rolling the edge underneath to make my life a bit easier here, while retaining strength and durability. It is the inside of a hat after all. Alright, moment of truth. Time to pop her right way out and give it a try. Test the flap securing mechanism. Low 360. I'm thrilled with how this turned out and so glad that I can give my brother the gift he wanted while putting all my love and a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears into it too. All that's left is to wrap it up and deliver it to the birthday boy. Follow me on Instagram at Maya Ginsburg and subscribe.